Good evening, everyone. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's presentation conversation between Larry Olmsted and Michael Patrick Shields. Thanks for attending. FAN's a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, and now sports, among others. We have over 125 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for formal introductions. Larry Olmsted is an award-winning journalist who has been a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, where he taught nonfiction writing. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Real Food, Fake Food, and Getting into Guinness, a history of the Guinness Book of World Records, a book for which he broke 3 world records himself while researching. I want to know more about that. His latest book, Fans, How Watching Sports Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Understanding, argues that sports act as a cultural currency, a global language, and a source of healing, and it displays recent groundbreaking studies into the effects of sports fandom. He currently writes online columns for Forbes and USA Today, and he also appears regularly on television and radio. Mr. Olmsted is an avid fan of American Ninja Warrior, he'll probably talk about that tonight, and a passionate fan of sports fans. Michael Patrick Shields is an author, travel writer, and award-winning syndicated radio host. He has collaborated with the likes of Larry King, George H.W. Bush, and Jack Nicklaus. He is currently writing his next book, The Boy and the Bull, Fear and Parenting in Pamplona. So now let's welcome Larry Olmsted and Michael Patrick Shields.
I was watching ESPN. Sorry. Did you want to have some kind of intellectual conversation, Seth? Thank you for being here. And Larry Olmsted, let's start right there, because until your book, at this very important time, was it presumed that going to the game or sitting on the couch watching the game was not a good value for your time? It wasn't very enriching compared to, say, reading a book or exercising.
Well, I think that's certainly an opinion that non-sports fans have had, because that's the response I get when I talk to somebody who's not a sports fan. They say, oh, isn't it kind of a waste of time? You just sit on the couch. That's not really accurate, it turns out, but that's a perception that has been largely shaped by the portrayal of sports fans in the media, especially movies and TV. And I took a pretty deep dive in. I looked at every instance I could find of a TV show or movie that was about sports fans or featured sports fans. And the portrayal was universally negative. At the best, the sort of lovable drunken oaf, and at the worst, a psychotic criminal. So, sports fans haven't been portrayed very well in the media, which I think is why, if you're not a sports fan, you would have that presumption. But it turns out it's a stereotype that's just not true.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because very often the term that comes before the phrase sports fans is crazy sports fan, or obsessed sports fan, or a grown man that would go out wearing a Boston Bruins jersey, for instance, is looked on as less than intelligent. But maybe there's something to what he's doing. He must feel like more a part of something if he's willing to actually put on a hockey sweater.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I personally, before I started on this book, I really looked down on adults who wore sports jerseys in public. And I travel a lot for my work, and I go through airport. When you go through the airport, it seems sometimes like a third of the people walking past you have a team jersey on. And I'm always looking and saying, like, no, wait, you're not Tom Brady, you have that name on. It's like trick or treat all the time. But it turns out that that's really part of what gives the benefits of sports fandom and makes it different from other kinds of entertainment, that fans are compelled to take part to such a degree and be, as you mentioned, part of a community. I mean, the psychologists who study fans have identified about 24 different mental health factors for which sports fans score better than non-fans. Important things like having higher self-esteem and lower rates of depression, feeling less lonely, more satisfaction with their social lives, 24 attributes, but all of them pretty much come out of this one thing, which is a sense of belonging to a community, to a group. And that's something that's in our DNA. I mean, humans are tribal animals, goes back to caveman days. As soon as there was humanity, we formed groups and villages and city states and towns and countries, and have always wanted to live together in some sort, be part of something bigger than ourselves. And sports fandom offers that in a really easily accessible way. There's no application or judgment. You don't have to be approved. You just become a Chicago Bears fan and you're a Bears fan. And every one of those communities is diverse in terms of sex, age, religion, political belief, education, economic background. So you become part of something very diverse that's linked by your love for the team. And that's what sports fans feel like they belong to something. That's what makes them happy. But what you mentioned about the jersey is the other layer that elevates it above other kinds of popular entertainment to a degree, is that you're exposed to subconsciously to that feeling of belonging all the time. When you go to the supermarket and you're wearing your Cubs hat and somebody's coming at you with a Cubs hat, you kind of make eye contact. And one NHL executive I talked to calls this the head nod, right? You look, you nod your head a little bit. We're connected. Again, we could completely different backgrounds, different people. We have this in common. And that's something you see when you go out. You don't have to be watching a game and you leave feeling good because of the Cubs or whoever you follow.
Is there any difference in value to watching sports, as we said, on the couch at home, as opposed to going to the game, almost like you're, going to a religious service?
Yeah, well, certainly going to the game is the most intense that it typically gets, because if it's a sold out crowd, depending on the sport, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 people, shoulder to shoulder, all that electricity. And you really you're part of a crowd has something in common. But the reality is most people watch most of their sports on TV, even with, even if every Bears game is sold out, that doesn't make nearly account for all the people that watch football on TV. So you get a lot of the same bang for the buck on TV. And again, it's one of the things that differentiates sports from other kinds of entertainment. Like, I'm personally a Star Wars fan. I love Star Wars. But when I sit on my couch and watch a Star Wars movie for the umpteenth time, I know I'm alone on the couch watching a Star Wars movie. But if you watch, your team playing, people think they're watching a football game. But what they're watching is a stadium, an arena that's full of spectators and players. And you see them all the time. You can't watch a football game or a baseball game or hockey game or any professional sporting event pretty much that's not in a pandemic and not see all these people who are wearing jerseys and holding up foam fingers and rooting. And that's why when psychologists interview sports fans, even if they're home alone watching it, they feel like they're at the game. They feel that they're part of something. And that really makes a difference. That gives them that sense of belonging as if they had gone to the game, but they don't have to leave home or buy really expensive season tickets to do it.
It's funny you say that, because very often when there's a remarkable sporting event, you would hear people say, I was at that game and it was fantastic. And they sort of figured out that the stadium would have to have held 1 million people if everybody who claimed they were at the game was actually at the game. Is that because of the connection?
Well, I think in general, people want, bragging rights to say they met a celebrity, whatever it is, that's part of that. But what it does show is just how people remember those really big events in sports. One of the, I read dozens of books during the research for this, everything I could get that was related to sports fandom. And one of the books I read was a book by Mark Bowden, who's best known for writing Black Hawk Down and Killing Pablo, which they based Narcos on. But he wrote a book that's not nearly as well known called The Greatest Game Ever Played, about the Giants Colts game that that was the first NFL game or first professional football game in national prime time on the new medium of television, live television, and really made football what it is today. And he said he compares it not to other sporting events or other TV shows, but to things like the moon landing, like that monumental, or the JFK assassination. You remember, if you saw that game, which was the most watched sporting event in history at the time, you remember it and you knew where you were and you knew where you watched it. So it's that, yeah, that kind of power.
What about going beyond just watching in a stadium or watching on a television to actually participating? Does sports inspire people maybe to be more healthy by saying, I'm going to give that a try when they can?
Yeah, it does. And that was one of the really pleasant surprises I had, out of this. I mean, the title of my book has 3 components, right? How watching sports makes us happier, healthier, and more understanding. The happier is mostly those mental health attributes that are really well documented. That's something that's been studied, hundreds of studies around the world. Different fans of different sports have had sort of the same results with sports fans enjoying these higher levels of positive mental health. When I say healthier, I mean, that includes mental health as well, but I'm talking to some degree about physical health. And that's a little bit of a murkier one because, clearly it's been demonstrated that sports fans are more active than non-fans. That's well known. That's been proven. But the question is why? Or, chicken and an egg. Because some sports fans are sports fans because they're more active already. Maybe they played Little League or they played Pee Wee football or youth hockey or just love sports, playing sports, so they're naturally sports fans. So in that case, it's not sports that makes them more healthy, more active. It's the reverse. And that's really hard to sort of break out and differentiate in these studies. So what I did was I went looking for specific examples of what they call the participation effect, which is when somebody who is otherwise sedentary is directly motivated by watching sports, usually on TV, and then goes out and pursues it and participates. And when they do that, that's really good for society. We have an obesity epidemic and a lot of public health issues around that, diabetes. And, the government keeps coming out with these, that you should stand X minutes a day and go put on your step counter and get your steps in. And that sort of consensus in the medical world is anything that gets people up and moving is good for society. And there's several ways. Our sports is not a panacea. Some people watch sports and never get up and get moving. But one of the biggest examples of this participation effect, which is about to come around, is the Olympics. Every 2 years, and when I was growing up, it was every 4 years, but now it's every 2 years, so it's even better. Like clockwork, after the Olympics, there's a big spike in gym memberships, fitness club memberships, and participation in what they call general fitness pursuits, which is things just like going and using the elliptical or taking a yoga class or a spinning class. They're not a sport like going and playing hockey, but the idea is that when people watch the Olympics, there's a couple of reasons for it with the Olympics are unique because they get people who are not maybe hardcore sports viewers still tune in. And whoever tunes in is typically watching sports that they don't normally follow, right? Things like rowing and hurdles and even gymnastics, which is really popular. Most people don't watch, and figure skating don't watch the rest of the year. And they're typically also sports that showcase individual physical excellence, training, athleticism, rather than team sports. So people are just inspired, and it's like a New Year's resolution. People watch the Olympics and they're like, I'm going to get in shape. And some percentage of the viewers go and do that. And that's important. And then there's also a percentage of the viewers who actually try a specific sport because they saw it at the Olympics. And this usually happens when there's new sports introduced. So over recent Olympics, triathlon, beach volleyball, these are all things where they saw spikes when they were first introduced in the Olympics because nobody had seen it before on TV. And for the Tokyo Olympics, the 2 new sports are surfing and rock climbing. And they're both sort of adrenaline, high energy, exciting action sports that are fun to watch, but most people have never watched them. And the rock climbing in particular that they're doing is indoors. It's a gym-based fake wall, not out in El Capitan, So anyone who watches, who's interested, can go to the gym. You can go in downtown Chicago or downtown Detroit. The thing about this is it's accessible everywhere in the country in any weather. So I can pretty much guarantee you, based on history, that there's going to be a surge in people giving that a try after the Olympics. So there's a lot of other examples of the participation effect. Lance Armstrong and cycling, Michael Phelps and swimming, golf have all gone through this. but where, and it's good anytime people go and start being active because they watch TV, and it doesn't happen with, watching Game of Thrones.
Your book, Fans, portends that you will be happier and healthier by being a sports fan. But what if your team stinks? Couldn't it make you unhappy all the time? Like pick a team like the Detroit Lions, for instance. Nothing but frustration for generations.
Yeah, I mean, that is probably the question I get asked the most. And, sports fans say, I'm not happy, I'm a Jets fan, or I'm a Lions fan, or, whatever it is. But there's a couple of parts to this that are really interesting. I mean, one is the sports psychologists I talk to, talk about all these coping mechanisms that fans have developed to make their enjoyment of the wins greater and the losses less troublesome. And one of them sort of described it as like a fan thermostat you have in your brain, where when they win, you can get as hot as you want, but it's never going to drop below a certain level that's sort of preset in your head. And a good example of that is the Super Bowl this year. If you're a Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan, you're the underdog. You don't have a lot of Super Bowl trophies in your, on your shelf to begin with. And you're the first team ever playing the Super Bowl at home, and you win. And it doesn't get any better than that for the fans. So on a scale of 1 to 100, that's like 100 right there. But the Kansas City Chiefs, the losing team, their fans, it's not a 0. They had a great season. They have Patrick Mahomes, arguably the best quarterback, most exciting quarterback. They won the AFC going away, and they got to play in the Super Bowl. So they're unhappy they lost, but they did better than every other team. So for them, it's like a 20 or a 25 or a 30, but it's not a 0. So the winning gives you more upside than the losing gives you downside. And another one of the really interesting coping mechanisms fans have, and one of the sports psychologists told me if fans hadn't perfected coping mechanism, there would be no sports fans, right? If you look at it, I mean, one team wins the Super Bowl, one team wins the World Series. If you looked at it, as losing made you unhappy, then that would be 95% of all people who watch sports or more, but they're not. And one of the things study after study has shown in terms of people subconsciously wrapping themselves in the team's victory while distancing themselves from defeat is that they always say, when my team wins, I'll always say, we won the Super Bowl. Yeah, the team and me, I had something to do with it. But when they lost. The team lost. I didn't lose. We didn't lose. And that's the language sports fans use because they're, separating themselves from the failure and reveling in the victory. And then when you do have the really long suffering fan, and there's no better example in sports than Chicago Cubs, right? 108 years. It's a long road to hoe, but when you win that big one, it is that much sweeter. And every Cubs fan who was alive for that World Series will remember it the rest of their lives. Even, they want to win another one, absolutely. But even if they never do, and that's what another thing the psychologists say, that the big wins you always remember. People can remember who was on the team and the score and things like that. But the losses is that kind of time heals all wounds. So I'm a Mets fan. I remember the 1986 Mets, the last time they won the World Series, right? That's 35 years ago. I remember, who Dwight Gooden and who was on the team. But I don't really remember the 1983 Mets or the 1989 Mets or the 1993 Mets or the Mets that have muddled through, the decades since their last win. And finally, when you have a team like the Lions or the Cubs, the not winning for a long time actually kind of enhances the pride of the fans because they're hardcore and they're suffering and they're still fans and nobody is jumping on the bandwagon. So they feel like they're the true fans. And some Cubs fans I interviewed a lot of Cubs fans, especially older ones, had kind of mixed emotions because they really wanted to win that Super Bowl, but it also took away a little bit of what made them so special. And all things come around. I can remember when the Saints fans used to wear paper bags over their heads at the games, right? Because, they wanted them to know that they were embarrassed to be there, yet they were there. There's a fun to it. And then, they get Drew Brees and they win the Super Bowl. So it kind of, the Lions someday will be competitive, I'm sure, Michael.
When you were researching, actually, I'm going to change my question now because I was going to say don't bet on it. And that leads to one of my other questions. As somebody who set a Guinness record for playing poker for the longest stretch, somewhere around 75 hours straight. You did that. Does betting and the now growing ability to bet legally on sports, sometimes even online, change fandom a little bit? Are you willing to sell out your team for $1?
I don't really know the answer to that because it's not something that I looked at, because I think a couple of reasons. One is it's very new. Until very recently, you could only legally bet on sports in person in Las Vegas. It was the only venue in the country. And suddenly, there hasn't been a lot of research. It's changed so quickly. I mean, there was always bookies and illegal betting in the rest of the country, but there's not really statistics on that because it's under the table. But also, I think a lot of fans like to bet on their team. For them, it's like part of the fun. If they go to Vegas, they'll put $20 on their team or whatever. They're not professional gamblers. I mean, most gamblers are not professional gamblers. And then, gambling is its sort of own thing. I mean, I saw some stat where something like 70% of the US population lives within a 2 or 3 hour drive of a casino now, right? There's casinos, hundreds of casinos all over the country. Obviously, people like to gamble. They're keeping those casinos in business. But I think people are going to gamble on something, whether it's, craps or video poker or slot machines or sports. I think it's more sports gambling is part of gambling more than it's part of sports. But what I did look at, which is similar, is fantasy sports, where typically, and there is a gambling component to that as well. There's these like FanDuel daily where people are trying to make money, but the majority of people participating in fantasy sports, and certainly the majority of the ones I spoke to, which was a lot, are people who are in it for fun. Now their league has a $20 or a $50 or $100 season buy-in, and they get money at the end, but most of them don't get anything. And if they do, it's like an office pool on the NCAA. It's not a for-profit enterprise.
Okay, then, with gaming, they'll often say to bet with your head, not over it. It can become an addiction for people. Were there any examples in your research for the soon to be known as a best-selling book, fans who had gone too far or were too rabid or were too attached?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's about close to 200 million people in the United States who identify themselves as sports fans, right? It's more than half the population. Same worldwide, several billion people. So when you take, more than half the population, there's going to be people in that group who are, bad apples, in any large crowd. And like one of the sports psychologists said to me, if 1% of the people going to a game are that guy who's going to get drunk and yell obscenities and annoy the people around him, well, if there's 50,000 people at the stadium, that's 500 people. 1% is small, but that's 500 people. And then when you space them through the stadium, that means you notice that person who's 15 rows below you who's acting like that because they're an anomaly in a sea of people around them, and they stand out because they're not usual. So yeah, there's a small percentage of sports fans for whom it's a problem, and typically that is excess, whether it's they devote too much of their time to watching sports that, to the point of the detriment of their family or their jobs or whatever else in their life, or more often money, which could be gambling, but just being a sports fan itself, if you let it, can be very expensive. It can also be very cheap. You don't have to buy licensed jerseys, and you don't have to buy season tickets to the Yankees. Most people can't afford to buy season tickets to the Yankees. And you can watch sports on TV, presumably for free, or now for whatever you pay for your cable bill or your streaming service. But yeah, to be a season ticket holder for professional football, most major sporting events, to buy hot dogs and $15 beers at the game and team paraphernalia can add up to a pretty big ticket. And if you can't afford it, that's a problem.
Let's go back to the title of the book, Fans. You say happier, healthier, and more understanding. What do you mean by more understanding?
All right, this is kind of one of my favorite parts of it because obviously, it doesn't take that big a leap to think like if you love watching football, then watching football is going to make you happy, right? That's kind of obvious. You're going to get enjoyment. That's why we're fans. But sports fandom has a long tradition of positively impacting our society by transforming the fans themselves. And that transformation has been towards more tolerant, more open-minded, more democratically minded people, which to me is good for society overall. And that's a tradition that, it stretches back to way before Jackie Robinson, but that's what we really associate with a turning point in sports and its role in the civil rights movement, which was immense and predated, the Civil Rights Act and a lot of other things. And when Ken Burns did his documentary of Jackie Robinson, he said, without Jackie Robinson, you could never have President Obama be elected. And I thought, well, that's, kind of a bold statement. I agree with him about a lot of things about Jackie Robinson, but that might be like a little bit of an overreach. But then President Obama said, without Jackie Robinson, I couldn't be in this office. So, there's something to that. But it's not just Jackie Robinson, and it's not just civil rights. Sports fandom played a role in, first of all, empowering a lot of immigrant and minority groups, as well as then continue that same civil rights kind of role through women's rights, then LGBTQ rights, and now is playing an important part in the social justice movement. So sports fandom has been mostly ahead of the curve of what I would consider positive social change for a long time, and continues to be. So that's the more understanding. And there was a really interesting study, a professor at the University of Michigan who studies the impact of sports on society, did a study in the UK, was the first country in Europe to really open its premier soccer league to immigrants. At one point it was all English guys playing, and then they started recruiting players. And it was the first time a lot of the fans had seen somebody from, Central Africa playing a sport, or, where they came from all over the world. And he ties that to a few decades later, the English Parliament is the most diverse political elected body in Europe because of the fans being exposed to that diversity through soccer. So it's very similar to what happened here in the civil rights movement. And it's a largely subconscious process, but which I detail exactly how the mechanism works in the book. But, it's made us more understanding, and I stick by that.
Are there examples, say, citywide or region-wide or statewide, of sports teams helping with renewal or lifting up spirits of downtrodden places?
Oh, absolutely. And part of that is, I ended up not really including this in the book, but I did a lot of research into the urban renewal factor. And there's definitely some certain cities like particularly Denver and Indianapolis, whose citizens, I think, have massively benefited from sports stadiums and the redevelopment of their downtown. It's a little bit of a thorny issue economically, because usually the public has to pay the taxes on those stadiums, and most stadiums are bad deals for the public. I'm not here to advocate taxpayer money for stadiums, but what I did find, the really pronounced effect to me was this post-traumatic healing power that sports has after natural and man-made disasters. This is my single favorite part of the book, because it was both familiar and totally new to me. I'm from New York City originally. I grew up in Queens, so the first sporting events that I ever went to were Mets games at Shea Stadium. And then when I was in high school, I worked in the World Trade Center. So I remember, very well, after 9/11, was the last time before this current pandemic that we had a total national shutdown of all professional sports for 9 or 10 days following 9/11. The first game that was played after that was a Mets in New York. The first professional sports game to return to New York was Mets Braves game at Shea Stadium. And it was, as often happens in these like high profile moments, a sort of Cinderella story, which everybody hangs on. Mets catcher Mike Piazza hit an 8th inning home run, come from behind, the Mets win, the crowd goes wild, the city goes wild. And people at that game said, one fan I talked to said, it was it was the moment when it was okay to smile and clap again. And there was a woman at the game whose husband was a firefighter who was killed in the World Trade Center bombing, and went to that Mets game with her kids. And she said that when Mike Piazza hit that home run, it was the first time since their dad died that her kids smiled. So that's a pretty powerful thing, but I knew about that. I, had lived in New York, but I thought it was sort of an isolated incident because 9/11 is an isolated incident, right? It's so high profile. Excuse me. But I discovered that it's not. Sports has played this role over and over all around the world for a long time, after war, after famine, after hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes and bombings. And after Pearl Harbor, Major League Baseball was going to stop playing. And President Roosevelt begged them not to, because he knew that people needed something to distract them from this terror of being attacked on our home soil for the first time. And after the Boston Marathon bombing, right, this whole Boston Strong, the reaction to it really brought the city together. Even as, that was a weird situation because they had this ongoing manhunt. It wasn't resolved and everybody was terrified. And Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey. But to me, the Las Vegas 1 October shooting, which was in 2017, this is the most current, really vivid example of this. And it was one where it's recent enough where I was able to actually go out to Las Vegas and interview people. And it was kind of a perfect storm, because what a lot of people don't realize is that Las Vegas was the largest city in the United States that didn't have a professional sports team in any of our 4 big major sports, right? City of 2 million people, no hockey, no football, no baseball, no basketball. So when they get their NHL expansion team, the Golden Knights, it's a really big deal, a bigger deal than a new hockey team would be in any other market in the country. And then, 9 days before the first game, they have the worst mass shooting in US history. And the city is just traumatized, understandably. And the team really stepped up. The players went and hosted blood drives and visited shooting victims and first responders and really wrapped themselves into the fabric of the city. And then when they debuted, every game was sold out. And I talked to a woman who had been at the event and was shot at and fled, and some of her friends were shot, and she survived and was afraid to leave her house afterwards. Talked to her therapist on the phone. Friends had season tickets to the Knights. They invited her to a game. She wouldn't go. They invited her a game. She wouldn't go. I think around the 5th or 6th game, she's seeing it on TV. She's hearing all this hoopla, and she decides, okay, I'm going to go give this a try. Go back out, not just leave my house, but go back into a big crowd on the Strip where the last time I went, there was a shooting. And she does it, and she'd never been to a hockey game before. She was a sports fan, but had never seen hockey, falls in love with it, and goes to 50 more Knights games that season, and tells me that, basically it saved her life. I talked to another guy who was shot in the chest, spent 11 nights in the hospital. And the day after he was released, he went to a Knights game. And all of these people in Vegas, I talked to the mayor, I talked to cab drivers, I talked to bartenders, one after another. Wow, we could have gotten through this without the Knights. And it was so palpable that it was at that moment on that trip that I realized, some people dismiss sports as like frivolous or entertainment, but it's not. It's a vital part of the social fabric of our lives, and it makes a big difference to a lot of people.
Has sports helped us through the COVID era?
I think absolutely, and I think this is another case where certainly, usually it's been sort of post-traumatic healing. This time it's been during the trauma and will be afterwards. I mean, when all sports was shut down, everybody was like, when is it coming back? When is it coming back? And then the first things that were on TV that were live were not the most popular sports. I think German professional soccer was sort of the first thing that came back, and the ratings were up like 600%. NASCAR was one of the first major sports to come back. But then as they did, I've heard anecdotally from people that I had interviewed for the book, I get emails, calls saying, I've never watched as much sports as I have in the last year. And these are people who watch a lot of sports. So, when we're home, just like, the streaming services, Netflix, everybody who provides entertainment sort of benefited from everybody being stuck at home. But the power of sports post-traumatic is a restoration of normalcy. Like, again, after 9/11, it's the moment it's okay again. And I think when you can go back to a Tigers game, and for you in Michigan, or a Cubs game there in Chicago, or a White Sox game, and sit shoulder to shoulder with 50,000 strangers and give somebody a high five without feeling like it's going to kill you, that's, when the light at the end of the tunnel has arrived. That will be, post-COVID, and there's no better way to signify that than through sports. And also, it's worth noting, whenever there's any kind of a trauma, but especially something like this that's kept us bottled up for so long, people want to go out. They're cooped up for some period of time. There's a lockdown mentality, and then they want to go out and be in society again. And there's no venues in this country or in the world that are bigger than sporting events for that. They're, the biggest sports venues, and I think the biggest stadium in the U.S. is the Big House at the University of Michigan, not far from you. But they're bigger than any church, any mosque, any synagogue we have. If you want to go out and reintegrate yourself into society, there's no place that's easier or bigger to do it than a sporting event.
Are you surprised by the national attention and publicity that your book Fans is getting?
Not really, just because there's so many sports fans, and one of the things that my books have been about very different topics, right? Food, Guinness World Records, sports fans, and so have the thousands of articles I've written over the last 25 years for magazines and newspapers. But my sort of thing that I look for is a story that hides in plain sight, a topic that everybody knows about, looked at in a new way, right? Everybody knew about food, but I looked at it in a new way, and my last book was a bestseller. The Guinness Book of World Records, everybody knows what it is, but nobody really knew anything about the story. And with sports, in the spectator sports equation, 99.99% of the participants are fans, are spectators, right? I mean, the number of professional athletes, coaches, and support staff are insignificant when compared to the number of fans. Yet there have been thousands of books written about sports, and they're almost exclusively not about the fans. So to me, I thought this was a big void to be filled. But what I'm hoping, and is it's not just fans, because again, obviously, if you're a sports fan, you're going to find a lot in my book to relate to. You're going to have that memory of the family bonding, or the first game you went to with your dad or your grandpa, your grandma, your siblings. There's these kind of common shared sports memories we have, and people like that, and it'll trigger that. But what I really wanted to do is reach the non-fan and show them that they live in a better world because of sports fandom, whether they ever watch a game or not. And that's the things like making us more tolerant, open-minded, better people and better citizens, the post-traumatic healing, the surprisingly extensive role sports has played in international diplomacy, nation building, reconciliation, the peace process. So there's a lot of things in there that people are not what comes to mind when you think about sports fans. It's not all like, hey, look, I have a jersey and I'm watching football from the couch. It's public health issues, public social justice issues. So I'm hoping it resonates with the non-sports fan as well, because whether they ever watch sports or not, they should know the impact it has on their life.
That's interesting, because while you were saying that, I was remembering that very often in a big game, you will have the mayor of one city bet the mayor of the other city, the Stroh's beer from Detroit versus Old Style from Chicago or something like that. And a soccer ball showed up. It was either Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un with the previous president at one of their summit meetings at the press conference, a soccer ball.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed a few ambassadors and a lot of diplomats and foreign service people for the, sort of diplomacy section. And one of the ambassadors, I asked him, I said, the sports have a long history in, international politics and negotiation. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And he's like, oh, well, of course, it goes back to ancient Greece. We've always used it. And, people don't realize this, but the UN has an entire arm devoted to using sports to reach its goal.
Is that
Everything.
right?
Yeah, and
Huh.
it has like 12 subdivisions. The Vatican formed a council called Sports in the Service of Humanity to leverage sports to, further their goals. And if you look at, the UN Charter, not many people read it for fun, but I did. It says very little about politics, right? It's all about humanity and making the world a better place. And if you read the Olympic Charter, it says very little bit about sports. It's all about humanity and making the world a better place. They're actually very, very similar documents, even though one is for games and the other one is for world peace. And there's a lot of overlap there. But that also gets into that issue. Right now, there's a lot of people saying sports and politics shouldn't overlap. And that's become a hot button issue, especially with the All-Star game and Mitch McConnell. But as you point out, they've always overlapped, right? And the mayors, every world leader goes to the World Cup games. Mike Pence goes to the Olympics. Some representative throws out the opening pitch, goes to games, has winning teams to the White House. FDR brought Joe Louis to the White House when he was going to fight Max Schnelling and said, Joe, we need your muscles to go beat Hitler. Clear, kind of propaganda, but the politicians have always used sports. It's never been divided. So, I think to say that is a little bit, it's just false. It's like, keep politics out of sports. Well, you can't, because they've always, the sporting tradition traces back to trying to stop a period of never ending war in the Greek city-states. So.
And one of the most well-known people on planet Earth was Muhammad Ali. And it wasn't amongst boxing fans, and it wasn't just among sports fans. He was just larger than life worldwide.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I talk about Ali, in the context of the civil rights movement, because when he first came on the scene and he protested the war in Vietnam, and people hated him. He was vilified. He was not popular at all, and people wanted him locked up and his titles taken away. And yet, 40 years later, he's one of the most beloved figures in America. And you say not just a sports figure, beloved figure, period, sort of a national idol. And that's the change in mentality that can happen among sports fans in, it's not overnight, but, again, in his lifetime, he won them over. They eventually came to see that, a lot of his viewpoints were the right ones morally from the beginning.
How about a lightning round here before we run out of time? These are questions from people who have joined us or plan to join us tonight. And the first one is, what's considered to be the healthiest sport to view as a fan? That comes from Max in Chicago.
Yeah, so from a mental health perspective, any sport that you enjoy that makes you happy will give you those kind of benefits of that sense of belonging. Though I think, team sports lend themselves more to the community than individual sports like tennis or golf, where you're a tennis fan or a golf fan, but you're not a, Cubs fan. So it's a slight level of detachment down in terms of the community. In terms of physical health, watching any sport is not going to actually make you healthier while you watch it. But in terms of that participation effect, I would say the Olympics, or, my example I use in the book of this is American Ninja Warrior, right? It's a crazy show that I've come to love personally. But one of the reasons I started watching it and did this research was because it was created out of whole cloth. It was a sport that didn't exist until they made a TV show. And now there's hundreds of ninja training gyms across the country. And they get a very multi-generational. Parents come with their kids and they all work out, that kind of thing. And clearly, nobody was working out in a ninja training gym before this show went on TV, because there was no such thing. So this to me is a real concrete example of sports on TV motivating people. So I would say American Ninja Warrior is the healthiest show you can watch.
Winnetka, Illinois, Janet wants to know, how do you pick a team if you're not a sports fan and you want to adopt one?
Yeah, I would say I get asked this a lot, but I'm not trying to sell sports fandom to people, because the reason you get these mental health benefits from watching a sport you love is because you love the sport. If I make you watch football and you don't like it, it's like me trying to make you work out or make you go on a diet, right? You got to want to do it. So don't pick a sports team if you don't want to, but if what I'd say rather is that there's a lot of sports out there. There's American Ninja Warrior, there's curling, there's tennis, there's America's Cup yacht racing, there's World Cup skiing. It's not just football, baseball, basketball. So to me, it's sort of hard to imagine a person who can't find a sport that they, gymnastics, figure skating, whatever it is, like there's almost got to be a sport that you could enjoy.
Evanston, Illinois. Rick wants to know, can entertainment fandom work? We'll start with that. I mean, if you don't like sports, can you be a fan of Beyonce, for instance? And can you get some of those benefits too?
You can, but in a lot of ways, it's a lot harder and a little bit different. So I would say the most comparable would probably be something like being a Harry Potter fan, where you can actually, get really into it, be part of a community, discuss it, go in chats, get dressed up, go to conventions, go to Comic-Con, be a Lord of the Rings fan, that kind of thing. But it's a lot harder because there's only so many Harry Potter conventions, whereas there's a, baseball game every day. And you don't have to dress up and you don't have to go anywhere. So, sports provides that in a really turnkey, accessible way. And most sports fans are fans of multiple teams and multiple sports. So you get it year round. And then also there are those things that exist outside of the stadium, the head nod I described. If you're a fan of Beyonce and you wear your Beyonce concert tour shirt to the supermarket and you pass someone else wearing them, yeah, you might feel that connection, but that's just statistically never going to happen compared to Cubs gear in your hometown. So it's a lot. Other forms of entertainment can fill in parts of it, but none of them offer the package sports does.
What about Mrs. Olmsted? Allison, is she a sports fan like you?
Not as much as me, but she had the benefit of having been born in the Bronx, and just like religion, the two factors that determine, what religion we practice and what sports teams we follow the most are where you're born and what your parents did. And if you're born in the Bronx, there's a good chance you're going to be a Yankees fan. If you're a Yankees fan, you're going to have probably a better chance of being watching in the baseball in the fall and caring about it than certainly being a Mets fan. So yeah, that's when, she gets jazzed up for that postseason Yankees, which is an awful lot of.
What do you remember as your first moment that you either were aware of sports or you were in love with it? What was it for you?
Again, I don't consider myself that avid a sports fan, so I've come to appreciate it a lot more since doing this book. But I would say, going to Mets games with my dad at Shea and him teaching me and my brother how to score, manually in the program with a pencil, and having popcorn and just that whole quality time family. And that's sort of been the universal. I talk to sports fans all over the world over the last few years, and everybody has that memory of the multi-generational beginning, whether it's going to the game or listening to it on the radio or having your first beer with grandpa, whatever it was. But then, growing up in New York is probably the least collegiate minded sports city in the United States. College sports just aren't big to New Yorkers. There's a lot of pro teams and no standout real college teams. So when I went to college and I went to Georgetown and we won the NCAA tournament, my freshman year, that was like a shock therapy immersion into that culture for me. So that's really the moment I saw how big, and obviously March Madness just wound down, but that was a big game changer, as we say.
I remember, yeah.
Oh, I just say I want to jump in at some point to get some of the audience questions in, but go ahead, Michael,
great.
please.
No, please. They're our guests. Let them go first.
Okay, good. Just a couple that have come in, so we're just going to go with the popular. First of all, I want to say this book right here. We have a link in the chat. If you don't have chat open, you should have had chat open. Buy this book. You'll get it if you buy it through the link that we have in our chat right here. You'll get an invitation to the after hours event, which is going to start At about 8:05, we give Larry and Michael both a 5-minute bio break once this ends at 8. So bye, get this book, come. It'll be just like you see right now. You'll be able to be on screen. You can ask your own questions. It's very lively and interactive. So that's my commercial, buy this book. And now here's a couple questions. So we'll go with the popularity contest. So Bessie is asking, I can look at her over here. Where did I put her? Bessie, there she is. Okay. What is the effect on the mental health associated with being a fan of a team that loses often? You did kind of address that a little bit earlier. And then she says, or fans who get upset during a game and then carry that frustration throughout the day.
Yeah, I mean, most fans are very well adjusted and get over. I mean, nobody likes to lose, but it's sort of a 50-50 proposition. And one of the psychologists I talked to said, you wouldn't go to a movie, pay and go to a movie you knew nothing about if you thought there was a 50% chance you would leave very unhappy. But we do that for sports because we know that most teams over the long haul are pretty average and lose around 50% of the time and win around 50%. The good news is you get more out of the 50% wins. So even if your team is dead even for your entire life, you come out ahead. But yeah, as I mentioned, there's a handful of fans who do take it too far, who can't let go.
Tony has both a quick comment and then the question. His comment is, I grew up in a very segregated anti-Black town. First, I'm sorry, I missed that. Let me retool. Opening sentence. Ernie Banks was my boyhood hero. I grew up in a very segregated anti-Black town. Ernie had a direct positive impact on my growth as a human being. So that was, I think, in response to your talking about how sports can provide that cross-cultural glue. And then his question is there a concern that pro sports are pricing themselves out of the common person market? The outrageous increase in ticket prices as well as outrageous concession prices.
I do worry about that. And it's, probably, I have no control over the teams, the leagues, but, it's something that I worry about a lot because on the one hand, most fans watch on TV and you can still do that. But what it takes away, I think, is the family dynamic. Like I just mentioned, my early memories of going to a game with my dad, and so many of the people I talk to have those early memories. And you can still have them at home, but there's going to be at some point a generation of sports fans who've never gone to a game because it's really expensive, especially, some teams and some sports. But, and I do think that that's unfortunate. And I think it's a little short-sighted because right now, a lot of sports leagues are suffering at the young end of their demographic. They can't rely on the older fans forever, and they have to be more proactive about getting new people into the game. But, that's their financial decision, I guess.
Mary asks, or she makes a comment and observation. It may sound odd, but it's more enjoyable, more relaxing, actually, to watch two teams that I do not care about than watching my own teams play.
I think there's something to that. And one of the things, I say in this book that I don't consider myself an avid sports fan, especially compared to some of the people I've interviewed. But I've become a very big fan of fans, and it's also made me more of a fan of the game. So now, like I love NFL football, but I'll watch any good game. So if I, look at the schedule and, hey, the Saints are playing the Chiefs, I'm like, I'm going to watch that. It's going to be a good game. And I enjoy it, but I'm not vested in it at all.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, okay, yeah, that I was going to say, does it throw off the same positive benefits to you if you don't have that vestment as a fan? At that point, you're more of a spectator, I would imagine.
Yeah, but, still enjoying it and still getting, positive vibes from it. But I'll still also watch my Bills when they play.
That's right. Anthony had asked, and you kind of addressed it a little bit, but I think he's asking a slightly different question. He wants to know a little bit about maybe during COVID, the pandemic and the shutdowns. Do you contribute a lot of the dissatisfaction felt during COVID? And he references Black Lives Matter. I'm not sure exactly where he's going with that, but he's talking about due to the halt of sports. Did you notice that, although you did mention, of course, that there were things being played on, reruns and stuff going on the screen, but the actual lack of being able to attend sports, do you think that it had any kind of stoking of a certain kind of dissatisfaction and tension or anxiety levels?
No, I mean, I think it definitely made some people more tense or more dissatisfied, with the fact that there was no sports on and they wanted the distraction. But certainly, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement was going strong before, COVID. No, I don't think that,
Yeah.
stoked that.
I agree. I did notice, I made a note to myself when you were talking about sports things that started being broadcast as the shutdown went into effect. And I was thinking about how the documentary, the multi-part documentary, The Last Dance, of course, about the, and as a Chicago and a Chicago Bulls fan, there was nothing quite so sweet as watching that documentary over those multiple weeks of being able to relive that just extraordinary season if you're from Chicago. So I think that was something that was, and I don't think just for Chicagoans, but I think for people to kind of have this thing of like, oh God, like remember all of that. It was, people were really, and maybe I am living in a cocoon here in Chicago, but I think it actually was meaningful to a lot of people, across the country.
It absolutely was, but that's one where, it's hard to say how well it would have done.
Right.
If it came out a year earlier.
Right.
But I certainly think, I mean, it crushed the records for any sports documentary ever on ESPN by, a huge, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but by like a factor of 10. They've made a lot of documentaries. And I think, yeah, certainly the fact that there was no live sports at the time. I mean, it was really good. It was really compelling. But, like my wife and I watched it and she doesn't follow the NBA at all. And we still hung where like, it's, after it's like Breaking Bad, after every episode, you want to start the next one.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it was helped by having kind of those candid present day Michael Jordan reaction shots, as he's watching people being interviewed about him. And then you see him like his big cigar sitting in his living room, that was pretty wild. There is a comment, I think a question comment, and it's actually from my brother who's on this. He says, will you concede that the Patriots are cheaters?
What I say in the book, that I think that, the Deflategate thing, and I should say I live in New England, but I am not a Patriots fan, so I don't need to make any apologies. I feel that the Deflategate punishment, which I think was a 4-game suspension, sort of matched the seriousness of the crime, which wasn't that serious. But I put that in the context of comparing it to other punishments that have been handed down by the NFL and other leagues that I think have been woefully insufficient. And that's a good point. I should mention, in pretty much every review of my book that's been done, the Wall Street Journal, whatever, they have said, that I don't just rah paint this one-sided picture. There's negatives in there too, that, and one of those is player wrongs. All
right, we have about a minute left. Michael, quick question from you, from Christine. She wants to know, is your green jacket your homage to the Masters kickoff?
It is indeed. Having that first round today back on this television I'm watching right here. And, people love that tournament so much. Tonight, they're going to repeat what they showed all day today for those fans.
And she made a thoughtful comment as well. She says, sports is the ultimate meritocracy. We admire those who train, achieve, and model what's possible. So many lessons on being a good human are embedded in sports. Championships bring people together who would never cross paths. Losses allow spectators to draw upon empathy, accept the outcome, and learn to do better next time. The stories of athletes who come to the aid of injured competitors is humbling. I think those are all nice points. Any last comments as we roll out of here? Maybe Larry, can you tell us really fast, besides playing poker for 75 hours, what are your other 2 Guinness World Records?
The first one was for the greatest distance traveled between 2 rounds of golf played in the same day, which is also one of the longest record titles. And that was 7,496 miles. So I played in the morning in Sydney, Australia, and that afternoon in Newport Beach, California.
Okay.
I will say humbly that I shattered the previous record by several thousand miles. And then the other one was the most different ski trails skied in their entirety in an 8-hour period, which was 64 at Crested Butte, Colorado.
Wow.
I was younger then.
I was going to say,
I
wow.
retired from Guinness record breaking.
All right. Well, thank you both, gentlemen. It was a great conversation. I look forward to continuing in the after hours. Everybody, thanks for coming. Make sure you grab that book, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. We'll open up the waiting room at about 8:05. So we'll see you all then. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.